Alright, so in this video we're going to review Chapter 2, which is Unit 4, Biochemistry. So in the first part of our unit in 2.1, we talked about what is the basic unit of matter, which would be an atom. And so we have to talk about what an atom is composed of. And so we have in the center of an atom is called the nucleus. And inside the nucleus we have our protons, which have a positive charge. And we have a neutrons, which are neutral charge. And then you can see in the structure that electrons are rotating around the outside of the nucleus and they have a negative charge. So when we look at elements versus compounds, an element is a pure substance and it's the same type of element bonded together. So a bunch of hydrogens would be an example of an element, a bunch of nitrogens would be an example of an element. When you combine two or more different types of atoms together, then that's when you make a compound. So water, carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxide, those are all examples of compounds because they're now two different atoms being bonded together. So when we talk about how atoms bond together, there are two types of bonds. There are covalent bonds, and co is a root word you need to know. That means together. So think of the atoms sharing electrons together. They are sharing electrons, and that's how they are attracted and bond together. Ionic bond is the other type of bond. In an ionic bond, you're transferring electrons, so you're giving and taking of electrons. And when you give and take away electrons, you get a slight charge. So when you lose an electron, you become more positive, and when you gain an electron, you become more negative, and it's the attraction between those two charges that allows them to bond together. So when we look at ions, when we have the proton and electron number, that helps us to determine what charge the ion would be. So an atom that's neutral would have an equal number of protons and electrons. An atom that has, let's say, 6 protons but 7 electrons, that must mean that it gained an electron, so it would have a negative charge. Let's say you have 6 protons but 5 electrons, you'd have more protons, so that must mean you lost an electron and you would be more positively charged and be a positive ion. So when we talk about in 2.2, that was the properties of water. And so one property of water is that it is cohesion. It can stick to itself. It likes to stick to itself. And so when you look at the penny in the penny lab and the big bubble on top, the bubble allowed it to stay on top because it was sticking to itself. Water can also be adhesion, so it adheres. It likes to stick to other things as well. So the reason why I was able to hang off of the side for quite a little bit was because it was sticking to the penny. Water was sticking to the penny. Water is also considered a polar molecule. And so what that means is when it's sharing electrons between hydrogen and oxygen, they're sharing unequally. And so most of the oxygens or the electrons are more around oxygen. So because the electrons, which are negative, are all around oxygen, oxygen becomes slight negative, and that makes hydrogen a slight positive charge. And so that allows for water to be considered the universal solvent. It can dissolve many variety of different things because of its polarity properties. Water can also split into hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions, and that can determine what is an acidic or what is a basic solution. So if you have an acidic solution, you would have more H plus ions in your solution. And if you are a base solution, you would have more hydroxide ions in your solution. So thinking about solutions and mixtures, again, if you were looking at these words solvent and solute, water would be the solvent, it does the dissolving, and salt or sugar or Kool-Aid would be solute. It would be what does dissolve in the water. Now sometimes things don't dissolve in water, and when it doesn't, we call that a suspension. Think of things suspending in the water, or think of Italian dressing where the herbs don't dissolve, they are suspended in, and that would be considered a suspension. So in chapter 2.3, we talked about these 4 macromolecules are needed for life, and they all have really one important thing in common, and that's carbon. Carbon is really important, and it's really great because it has 4 valence electrons on its outside, so it can bond with 4 strong bonds with other atoms, and so it likes to bond to itself, and it likes to bond to the other atoms of life, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus and sulfur, those other parts of the chanops, remember? And so when we look at these four macromolecules, there's carbohydrates, there's lipids, which are fats, there's nucleic acids, and there are proteins. And so let's talk about each one. So carbohydrates, they have carbon, they have hydrogen, and they have oxygen. And remember, they're used to be our main source of energy for life. And remember that we have the monomer that makes up a carbohydrate would be called a monosaccharide or glucose. And if you put a bunch of glucoses together, they make up the polysaccharide, the many sugars, a complex carb. And another name would be like starch in potatoes. Lipids, fats, remember they contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. And they have the monomer of the glycerol, and they have the fatty acid chains. And they are used for a waterproof covering, and they help make our cell membrane, and they help with food storage. Nucleic acids are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus, the most atoms. Remember, they're made up of nucleotides. So a bunch of nucleotides together make up DNA, and that is our genetic information, and that's what it's used for, is to have those inheritable traits be passed down. Proteins is the last macromolecule. Remember, they have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, and they are made up of amino acids. There's only 20 different amino acids in our body, and they're rearranged in different forms to make all the proteins in our body. And we need the proteins for lots of different things to help with controlling rates of reactions, making cell structures, allowing things to move in and out of cells, and help fight disease. When you look at a chemical reaction or a chemical equation, you know the left side of the arrow is called reactants, and the right side of the arrow is called the products. So this methane and oxygen would be the reactants. They react together, and there's the products, and when the reaction's over, they turn into carbon dioxide and water. So that leads us to enzymes. Enzymes are very important. They are proteins. Remember, they're proteins, and so they have a unique shape that fits a unique reactant, and they only have one job, and they're reused over and over and over again. And so when you look at this graph, this activation energy graph, you can see that the use of enzymes can lower the activation energy, so the amount of energy needed to start the reaction. Enzymes can help lower that, so you can use more energy to get the chemical reaction complete and be able to use those products at the end. This is Chapter 2, Review for Biochemistry.